Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mina Nutbeam, Program Manager for the CORES program at SAFE, also known as Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. If you're less familiar with us, CORES is a certification that recognizes owner-operators and third-party providers that have developed a robust commitment and capacity for providing resident services coordination in affordable rental homes. We know that to fully recognize the benefits of service-enriched housing, it's important resident voices and priorities are at the center of this work. And one of the measures to understanding if residents feel they have agency and decision-making power in their communities is civic and voter engagement. So with a significant election on the horizon in 2024, today we're excited to discuss strategies for resident services practitioners to support and lead voter and civic engagement initiatives. We know that resident services can play a critical role helping residents to be civically engaged in their communities. And in fact, SAFE data from our Impacted Home Report indicated that voter registration rates were actually higher at SAFE member properties with resident services coordination than at properties without resident services staff. This webinar will provide an overview of important nonpartisan resources to help residents register to vote, organize ballot measure campaigns, and engage with candidates. Next slide, please. So just a few logistical items before we get started. As a few of you are doing already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and share resources. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll be sharing the recording and slides after the presentations. And we'll also make sure that links are shared in the chat and after the webinar. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll hold time at the end for those questions to be answered. Next slide, please. So we want to kick off today's webinar with a quick poll on support for voter engagement. So we'd like to start by asking, how has your organization supported voter engagement initiatives? Are you very engaged and this is a current priority for you? Is this something where you've been engaged in the past and want to get involved again? Have you been not as heavily engaged but want to learn more? Or is this something completely new to you in your organization? We'll give folks a minute here to respond to this, and then my colleague Alexandra will launch the results for us to take a look at. It looks like we can probably go ahead and close the poll in a second or so here. Okay, so it looks like for quite a bit of you, you're very engaged in this work, over 33%. But for a lot of you as well, you haven't been as heavily engaged, but really want to learn more about this. And for some of you, this is completely new to you. So we're going to have a lot of resources today to share. And maybe for folks who are very engaged in this work, you can share some of your learnings as well in the chat. Next slide, please. So today we're excited to have two wonderful guest presenters today. First, we're going to hear from Courtney Cooperman from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, who's going to speak about their Our Homes, Our Votes campaign and how to get involved. And then we'll be hearing from Lauren Lagaki at POA Communities, who is going to share more about their voter engagement strategies and best practices. So thank you both so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I'm going to pass it to Courtney.
Thank you so much, Mina. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the project manager for the National Low Income Housing Coalition's Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. I'm excited to be here with all of you today and share some context about the role of resident services in nonpartisan voter engagement and how you can start thinking about planning voter outreach activities for the 2024 election cycle. We can go to the next slide. As a bit of background, the National Low Income Housing Coalition is a policy and advocacy organization dedicated to achieving racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures renters with the lowest incomes have quality, accessible, affordable homes in communities of their choice. We produce research that quantifies the scale of the housing crisis affecting the lowest income renters. We educate the public and policymakers about our findings, and we mobilize advocates to take action. 2024 is our 50th anniversary, and we're proud of all of the progress we've made in our mission. But we recognize that our ability to achieve policy change is limited unless elected officials see themselves as accountable to low income renters. And the way that we do that is by boosting voter turnout. Next slide. That's why we launched the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, which is a nonpartisan initiative to boost voter turnout among low income renters and elevate housing as an election issue. The campaign empowers housing providers, advocates, tenant leaders, and direct services organizations to register, educate, and mobilize voters in their communities. We know that everyone in this field is extremely busy and resources are always stretched thin. So, the goal of Our Homes, Our Votes is to increase the capacity of the affordable housing sector to do nonpartisan election work without ever reinventing the wheel. Next slide. Given all of the many demands on your time, why should resident services staff prioritize voter engagement? The benefits of high voter turnout for residential communities are clear. The American Medical Association passed a resolution in 2022 that recognizes voting as a social determinant of health. High voter turnout in a residential community also demonstrates the political power of that community to elected officials, which gives them the incentive to visit, to meet with residents and staff, and to take their needs into account in policymaking. Next slide. Unfortunately, too few residents of affordable housing are realizing these benefits. There's a stark gap in voter turnout between renters and homeowners, and an even greater gap between lower income and higher income people. In the 2022 midterm elections, only 37% of renters voted, compared to 58% of homeowners. One third of the lowest income people voted, compared to two-thirds of the highest income people. Renters, and especially low income renters, face structural barriers that make it more challenging for them to vote. Less flexible work schedules, childcare needs, limited transportation options, and in some states, restrictive voter ID laws are among the many obstacles that disproportionately deter low-income people from voting. Renters are also more likely to move between elections than homeowners. Whenever someone changes their address, they need to update their voter registration, but this process isn't always made clear or accessible. On top of these very concrete obstacles, low-income renters and others who have historically been disenfranchised in the political process are very justifiably skeptical that voting is worth their time, since they've seen elected officials fail to keep, fail to keep their promises year after year. Next slide. Fortunately, resident services staff are in a strong position to help residents overcome these hurdles and cast their ballots with confidence. In the 2020 elections, research from Nonprofit Vote found that low-income renters or low-income voters overall engaged by nonprofits saw a 7 percentage point boost in turnout over comparable low-income voters that were not engaged by nonprofits. Nonprofit staff and others who work closely with low-income people are trusted messengers that can convey nonpartisan information and clear up misconceptions about voting. And that's where you come in. We can go to the next slide. There's a robust menu of nonpartisan voter engagement activities that resident services staff may choose to implement in their communities. When people think of nonpartisan election work, they often think of voter registration, and that is absolutely a key ingredient of an effective voter engagement campaign. It's just the first one, but we'll start there. There are a few different ways that you may want to approach voter registration. You may choose to register voters by making voter registration forms available and visible in offices or common spaces, by tabling at community events, by door-to-door canvassing or hosting events that are specifically dedicated to promoting voter registration. It's also important to message this as asking voters to update their registration. Many residents may have registered at some point in the past. So if you ask, are you registered to vote? They may think, yes, of course. But they may not be registered at their current address. So you want to emphasize the need to update their records. But voter registration is, again, just the first step. Making sure that residents know how to cast their ballots and that their ballots are counted is also important. This leads to the second aspect of a nonpartisan voter engagement campaign, which is voter education. There are organizations you can partner with, like Vote Riders, that host voter ID clinics. You might also consider hosting a nonpartisan candidate forum where all candidates for a position are invited to speak to residents about their position on affordable housing and other issues affecting the community. This can show residents about what's at stake in the election and educate them on what the candidates are saying and what policies they might pursue in office. Or you could choose to publish a voter guide for residents with nonpartisan information about what to expect on the ballot. You can post signs in public areas or send out announcements through an online portal or any other channels for communication with residents about election dates, registration and mail-in ballot deadlines, and polling place times and locations. The third phase of a nonpartisan voter engagement campaign is voter mobilization or getting out the vote. You can make reminder calls, send reminder texts, or visit door to door any residents that registered at the earlier stage in your campaign and ask them if they have a plan to vote. Voters are much more likely to turn out if they've talked through their plan to vote, and it's a great opportunity to help them clear up any remaining questions related to transportation or other logistics. In most cases, you can provide transportation to the polls directly, coordinate group walks to the polls in locations where polling places are within walking distance, or partner with an external nonpartisan organization to offer rides to the polls. One organization that we're partners with is called Ride Share to Vote Aware. We can facilitate an introduction to them if that's something you're interested in pursuing. After the election, you can host a nonpartisan celebration to thank residents for their commitment to civic engagement. I'll get back to some details about this in a few slides when I talk about the do's and don'ts of nonpartisan voter engagement. Last but not least, you can incorporate voter protection or making sure that voters' rights are not violated. There's an election protection hotline, which voters can call at any time if they're turned away at the polls or face any form of harassment or intimidation. You can include cards or posters that have the information for the election protection hotline, which has both both a website and a number to call. That's a great way to make sure that voters are prepared to ensure their rights are protected. You can also inform voters about the opportunity to cast a provisional ballot if their registration status is challenged for any reason. The rules about provisional ballots differ by state, but in every state, there's the option to cast a provisional ballot. It won't be counted until the voter is proven eligible after the voting period has finished. So it's definitely worth looking into the laws governing provisional ballots in your state and making sure voters know how to follow up and get their ballot counted if necessary. Next slide. Now, of course, the question that we often receive is, we're a HUD subsidized property. Are these activities even legal for us, given that we receive subsidy from the federal government? The answer to that question is a very clear yes. In 2021, President Biden issued an executive order on promoting access to voting that directs federal agencies to facilitate voter registration and encourage voter participation. Following up on this executive order, HUD circulated announcements in February 2022 to its PHA, multifamily, SNAPS, and HOPWA distribution lists. These announcements clarify that PHAs and HUD subsidized owners are not only permitted, but are actively encouraged to organize nonpartisan voter engagement activities. We can go to the next slide. HUD-subsidized providers are clearly allowed to share nonpartisan voter and election resources with residents. They can permit the use of community space to hold nonpartisan meetings, candidate forums, and voter registration events. They can collaborate with local election administrators to use space for ballot drop boxes and polling place locations. The announcement for PHA directors gets into a little more detail and specifies that they can provide documentation of residence, they can apply to the state to operate as a voter registration agency, and they can make voter registration forms available, accept and transmit completed forms, and run PHA-initiated voter registration drives as permitted by state law. Next slide. There are also some activities that HUD clearly prohibits. The first category of activities that HUD subsidized owners and PHAs cannot do is anything partisan. You can't favor one candidate over another in any way. That isn't just a matter of explicit endorsement or campaign posters for one candidate. It also includes something like inviting one candidate to a forum or town hall without providing the equal opportunity or making the equal effort to get the other candidate or other candidates to attend. You can use an objective threshold like percentage of support in the polls, or dollars raised, the kind of thing that maybe would be used to determine qualification for a debate. But party status can't be the basis for excluding a candidate, and that includes like third parties or minor parties, unless you use some sort of objective threshold besides their party that could be used to exclude them. You can't advertise the importance of voter registration or voting as a means to benefit one party or candidate over another. So you can't say, like, register to vote to support this member of Congress's chances. That's not allowed. And you can't use facilities for partisan activities like phone banking for a candidate rather than nonpartisan reminders about the election. You also cannot give the impression that benefits are tied to a resident's voting activity or otherwise indicate that registration and voting are not voluntary. For example, you cannot host an election night party and only invite or only offer rewards to those who voted. You can go to the next slide. And of course, another question we get all the time is what funding is available to support these activities. The HUD announcements specify that Section 8 administrative fees and public housing operating subsidies may be used to fund these permissible nonpartisan voter engagement activities. Where PHAs fund resident councils, they may use funds to provide transportation to the polls as a resident service. We're currently in conversations with HUD, pushing them for greater clarity on resident councils using funds for other nonpartisan voter engagement activities besides transportation. So at this time, resident councils should consult with their PHAs about funding other election-related activities. They're not prohibited, they're just not specified in this announcement. We can go to the next slide. For more information about remaining nonpartisan, I highly recommend checking out resources from the Alliance for Justice's Bolder Advocacy campaign, which gives very clear and detailed guidance on appropriate nonpartisan election-related activities. We also have a compilation of the HUD announcements and a summary on the Our Homes, Our Votes website. Next slide. Now that we've covered what you can and can't do, let's get to the fun part. What are some best practices for nonpartisan voter engagement for resident services staff? And how can Our Homes, Our Votes support you in this work? The first step for any nonpartisan voter engagement campaign is to research relevant election laws, being mindful that they differ in each state. Consulting with your Secretary of State or Board of Elections is always a good way to gain clarity. Next, one of the most effective ways to promote a culture of civic engagement is to build engagement efforts into ongoing programs and processes. For example, as we'll discuss later, you can offer voter registration forms when residents sign their leases. Third, hold special events to celebrate the act of voting. The National Voter Registration Day is a nonpartisan civic holiday where thousands of organizations across the country mobilize to register voters. This is a great opportunity to host a block party or other community event and gain some more visibility for that event. Next, we recommend establishing partnerships with external nonpartisan organizations to add capacity. This could include the League of Women Voters, Vote Riders, Rideshare to Vote Aware, and others. These can help with organizing voter ID clinics, providing voter guides, staffing voter registration tables, sending volunteers to canvass, or providing rides to the polls, among other needs. And then, where possible, we recommend coordinating with tenant associations or other resident leaders. Tenants are trusted messengers that can effectively reach their neighbors through calling, texting, or door knocking, or making announcements about voting at community events. Next slide. As we covered in the HUD announcements, you can utilize community spaces for nonpartisan civic engagement activities like candidate forums or get out the vote events. Um, Next, bring the polls to you. Reach out to your local election office as soon as possible if this is something you're considering about the possibility of hosting a ballot drop box or polling place in a common area. Next, we already touched upon this. You can display flyers with key deadlines and election reminders in common spaces. You could also consider distributing voter pledge cards or other visual reminders for residents to have in their own homes. Next, prepare voters to cast their ballots with confidence. You can distribute a what to bring with you sheet to remind voters about ID requirements or anything else they need to know at the polls, including contact information for the election protection hotline. And last but not least, to assess the effectiveness of your campaign, you can consider purchasing the voter files for your community and seeing who is registered and who voted. This is a great way to see who was reached through your campaign and which activities were successful. Next slide. If you're interested in joining a peer learning community that will receive ongoing trainings on best practices in nonpartisan voter engagement, I highly recommend signing up for the Our Homes, Our Votes Housing Providers Council. We launched this group back in 2020 as a nonpartisan group of housing developers, property managers, resident services staff committed to boosting voter turnout in their properties. This year, the group will meet every other month to exchange ideas and receive trainings on best practices in nonpartisan voter engagement. We've had past trainings on complying with the National Voter Registration Act, transportation to the polls, language accessibility, and connecting residents with voter ID, among other topics. And I see Alexandra just dropped the link in the chat where you can learn more, and you can also find the application for the Housing Providers Council there. Next slide. Our first meeting of 2024 will take place next Thursday, February 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern. This meeting will focus on how housing providers can partner with healthcare providers to encourage voter turnout. We'll feature Emily Polak, who's the Vice President of Partnerships at Vote ER, which is kind of a parallel of Our Homes, Our Votes that's focused in the healthcare space. The Housing Providers Council also has a shared resource folder with sample materials from other members, more customized template resources. We'll have access to the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign's custom TurboVote voter registration platform, which will give greater capacity to analyze voter registration data. And we also foster connections with grassroots organizations in our members' communities. If you think that you would benefit from a training on a certain topic and want to recommend it for the Housing Providers Council agenda for this year, please reach out to me. Next slide. In 2022, the Housing Providers Council launched its flagship initiative, the Welcome to Vote Pledge. This is a nonpartisan declaration of commitment to integrate voter registration into the lease-up process and into income recertification. This pledge is modeled off the National Voter Registration Act. You may have heard of this as the Motor Voter Law. This is the law that requires the DMV to offer voter registration when eligible citizens are applying for or updating their license. When you're applying for a license, you're effectively supplying information to the government that could easily be used to get your voter registration up to date. Drivers get to register seamlessly when they visit the Motor Vehicle Authority, but no such requirement exists for residents of public and subsidized housing, who are also supplying the same information needed for voter registration when they lease up in a new home. Even though there isn't a law requiring subsidized housing providers to offer simultaneous voter registration, the Welcome to Vote pledge demonstrates that many providers are eager and willing to integrate voter registration into their processes. We can go to the next slide. Here's just a very quick snapshot of the pledge. I'm not going to read it word for word, but it's there in case you want to read it another time. Next slide. Just to give a little visual of what pledge implementation can look like, some of our signers are including the federal voter registration form in all of their move-in packets. We also have more creative forms of implementation besides just giving out more paperwork. I always like to highlight the Wisconsin Housing Preservation Corporation. They created fridge magnets in the shape of Wisconsin with a QR code to their state election office website. They've been distributing these magnets in their properties and have found that they're really popular. A lot of residents keep them up on their fridge. Next slide. So just another reminder, if you're interested in learning more about these best practices from peer organizations and trainings from experts, highly encourage you to join the Housing Providers Council. You're welcome to join this group whether you've been doing nonpartisan voter engagement and have success stories that peers can learn from, or you're planning on wading into this work for the first time in 2024. Everyone is welcome and encouraged to join the meetings. Next slide. One topic that we'll cover in the Housing Providers Council this year, and a resource that will be available, is the use of our brand new Our Homes, Our Votes TurboVote platform, which is a one-stop shop where voters can register, check their registration status, and sign up for election reminders. Housing Providers Council members will receive trainings on using TurboVote for strategic voter registration and voter outreach campaigns, and will be able to use this tool to help you track the impact of your activities. Next slide. So just to wrap up, I'll flag a few other Our Homes, Our Votes resources. We have a comprehensive online resource library at ourhomes-ourvotes.org with tips and template resources for planning every aspect of a nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement campaign. We're also hosting a webinar series that will launch on Monday, April 15th and run through mid-November. Each webinar will cover a different topic in nonpartisan election work. And we'll drop a link where you can find a preview of all of the topics. And I think Alexandra also dropped a registration link where you can register for that full series, get it on your calendar a little bit ahead of time. I think next slide, I think this is the last one. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. After Lauren's presentation, I'm looking forward to taking questions and hopefully collaborating with many of you on voter engagement work in this election cycle. I'll drop my email in the chat so you have that going forward as well.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Those are all amazing resources, and especially for folks on the call less familiar with voter engagement, a wonderful overview for them, as well as additional resources for folks to get involved. Definitely recommend checking out the Housing Providers Council and that webinar series. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Lauren to talk about their initiatives.
Thanks, Mina. Hi, everyone. It is great to be with you all today. My name is Lauren Legutsky. I'm the Director of Community Impact for POA's East Coast portfolio. And I was telling the CORES team and Courtney earlier that today is just especially a great day to be here because there's a local town election, a special election where I live. So the timing just feels really right. I'm going to talk, you can advance the next slide. I'm going to have to get used to that. I'm first just going to talk a little bit about my organization so you have a sense of our portfolio and how we operate. So Preservation of Affordable Housing, or POA, it's a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve, create, and sustain affordable, healthy homes that support economic security, racial equity, and access to opportunity for all. We are a nonprofit owner, developer, and management company of over 12,000 homes, and we operate in 11 states and DC. We have over 80 community impact staff across our portfolio, and that covers about 75% of our communities. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how to support voter engagement across so many states and so many staff. And, our community impact coordinators are not just focused on voting, they're also focused on helping people stay stably housed and pursue their goals. You can advance to the next slide. Thanks, Alexandra. And that's really what the core of our resident services is about, is helping to support residents in these different areas. And so everything, when we talk about voter engagement strategies, I'm always trying to think of ways to make this as accessible as possible for our staff who are already juggling so many different areas that they're trying to support residents in. And so we really want this to feel seamless for our staff so that all their energy can go into what really amounts to trust building and real kind of grassroots community engagement. So a lot of what me and my colleague Lisa spend our time doing when we think about voter engagement is how do we just make this as plug and play as possible, so that, we can let our creative community impact staff kind of take it and run with it for what makes sense for the communities that they're serving. So that's sort of the strategies that I'm going to talk about today. You can advance to the next question. And so why does POA care about voting if we are primarily a housing organization? I think Courtney did a beautiful job of covering those reasons, so I won't spend too much time here on that. But, civic engagement and resident agency are core to POA's mission. We can't achieve any of those things that I just listed out if residents don't feel like they have a voice in their own community. Also, as Courtney did a great job bringing light to, there is a disparity in voter participation between homeowners and renters, and all of the residents that we support are renters. So we see that as part of our core mission. And that's reflected in POA's current strategic plan. So it's not just something that we talk about, it's something that we've put real metrics on and are going to be measuring our progress towards. You can advance the next slide. Thank you. Great. So our community-based strategies for voter engagement focus on three main areas: voter registration, voter education, and mobilization. And so we're going to go through each of those now. So for voter registration, I think Courtney covered a lot of the strategies that we try to implement, but what I think about is, using existing touch points with residents to either help them register to vote or help them update their voter registration to their current address. So at move-in is a great time to, depending on how your state's paperwork works, to slip in a registration form or have that touch point, have that conversation. A lot of our property management staff at move-in will kind of explain briefly what the community impact coordinator's position is and kind of how they help support the community. And sometimes we'll even refer the resident to stop by their office. So, we really try to look for ways to implement updating someone's voter registration at move-in because it makes sense since their address just changed. And then another kind of existing touch point that our management team has with residents is when they're turning 18. So that's another opportunity for our community impact staff to work with management, to be reaching out to residents and saying, happy birthday, congratulations, you're 18, let me help you register to vote. And there are lots of different ways that looks like on the ground, depending on staff capacity. But those have been sort of two touch points that feel like no-brainers and don't feel like too much more of a lift than what's already happening on the ground. And those are also just passive engagement touch points. If those things are implemented, then that's, the topic of voting is reaching residents outside of a huge election year. And that just helps to, over time, build the culture of voter engagement at our organization and also in the community. So they're not just hearing from us about this every 2 years. And then on the kind of other end of the spectrum is that timing, I think, really does matter for a lot of engagement strategies. Sometimes folks just aren't really feeling like they want to follow through or engage until it is right before a primary or right before an election. And so that is really important to be thinking about too. You can do both. You can do passive, kind of passive strategies using existing touch points, or really kind of seize momentum ahead of deadlines or actual election days by engaging residents with things like voter registration stations or holding office hours. The CIC can advertise, come in anytime between 10 and 12 on Wednesday, and I'll answer any questions you have about voting, or I can help you get your registration up to date. It's also a great time to be thinking about when you are engaging partners and having on-site events, kind of timing those so that it's not too far ahead of a deadline or an election, and not too last minute either. So that timing we found has been really helpful. And then if you go to the next slide, so one thing that we've done, and this kind of speaks to what I mentioned earlier about trying to our central office trying to do as much of the heavy lifting as we can for our staff when we're asking them to do voter engagement. On the topic of registration, we put together these voter registration kits that we shipped to each community with a CIC staffed. And so that was great. Our central office team kind of all got together and put the kits together. But we tried to think of all the things that a CIC would need to set up a voter registration table. And that was really helpful for them because they didn't have to go out and get all of these things and print them out or buy them. It just showed up at their door and they could unpack it and know exactly what to do with it. So that has just been something that I heard a lot of really positive feedback from our staff about. And it just kind of took the lift out of it for a lot of folks. And they said, I don't know, I would have felt overwhelmed if not for that kit. And it just made it that much easier for them to jump into this voter engagement effort. Great. Okay, so, and then the next bucket being voter education. Our goal here is really to support residents to go to the polls confidently, to know what's going to be on the ballot and to decide for themselves, of course, how they want to vote, but to feel informed in doing so and like they know exactly what's going to happen when they show up to their poll. Again, kind of thinking about how to make this easy for our staff. We calendar it out. We are in 11 states and DC, but it's just enough work that we can still do it. We can kind of look up and do some research into every state's calendar every year and kind of see what the major deadlines are and the major election dates. And then we make that really accessible for our staff. And then from there, they can take that information, again, like they didn't have to go and find it themselves. They got it from us and they can incorporate it into their property's community impact programming, just like anything else. So having that in January and circulating it has been really helpful. It helps people plan out their year and understand, if you can do it on a calendar year, you can really understand like when you're going to be spending more time on voter engagement versus VITA versus summer camp enrollment, because again, like our staff are helping residents in so many different areas. So it helps to calendar that out. And then in terms of helping residents go confidently to the polls, we really lean on our, you can go to the previous slide, sorry, Alexandra. We really lean on our local partners for that. So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but in terms of remaining nonpartisan, when it comes to voter education, we found that, our CIC staff are generalists. They're not experts necessarily in voting engagement. Some of them are, but not everybody is. So that's where we lean into our local partners and really kind of, we find nonpartisan local partners and let them educate residents about what's going to be on the ballot locally. And that's worked really well for us rather than us having the capacity of training all of our staff to be subject matter experts on that. But, you know, a lot of that has to do with the size of our staff and our resources. So you might be in a different organization with a different set of resources, and you might strategically go about it differently. But what we've heard good feedback from residents about is if you're able to just distribute sample ballots, people really appreciate being able to see that ahead of time, and to know what it looks like. You know, we have folks that speak a lot of different languages in our communities, and different municipalities and states have different, you know, capacities for what languages they're providing, and our CICs are helping residents make sure that they have what they need when they get to the polls, or at least they know what's going to happen when they show up to the polls. And then the next slide is, you know, focusing on voter mobilization. In the days leading up to the election, we're really ramping up our support for our site staff in doing things like phone banking. So we even provide them a kind of a script that a lot of them I don't think follow word for word, but sometimes it can help a CIC who is helping 10 different families with 10 different things on a given day. And they're like, okay, I'm also supposed to be doing voter engagement. And they can pull up this script and kind of get back into that mindset before they're picking up a phone. And they're like, okay, I'm going to call 10 households while I have some time here. And yeah, maybe they don't follow our script. They probably shouldn't. It will sound a lot more organic if it's in their own voice, but at least just the key phrases and sort of the things to focus on are laid out for them. And we've gotten good feedback about that. Email blasts, you can create templates for your staff. That's like another easy way to kind of just take that like brain energy and just, you know, save them from having to kind of reinvent the wheel, and make that available, and they can customize it and make it their own. And then for door knocking, that really depends on the community. We kind of let CICs decide if they're comfortable with that. We always encourage them, if they do, to wear a POA Communities shirt so that it's really clear like who's engaging them. It's always nonpartisan. It can be helpful to develop like a FAQ card to leave at someone's door if they're not home. We have a lot of working families, so they're not home during the day. And then on election day, transportation came up for us when we surveyed residents. So we were able to get some of our community impact budget allocated for Uber and Lyft gift cards, and they were offered equally to everyone. It's always nonpartisan, but it was framed around like, if you need help getting to the polls, you can use this Uber or Lyft gift card. We didn't do it at all of our properties. We focused on properties where we heard from residents that transportation was a challenge. Organizing a walking group to the polls. So if your property is located near the polling place, then that's a great way to kind of have some camaraderie and support residents who maybe were on the fence or just didn't want to go alone, to have some community in that. And then, like Courtney had mentioned, you know, organizing an election day event for everyone to just celebrate the act of voting that's open to everyone is sort of just low-hanging fruit and easy to plan ahead of time. And then the next slide, these are just some important considerations that we thought through and think through continually. So next slide, for remaining nonpartisan. I already talked a little bit about this, but you know, we focus on registration regardless of party affiliation. When we're doing education, we're focusing on all the ballot questions and candidates. We're never endorsing candidates or ballot questions. You know, yeah, it's a lot of the same thing. Like, everything we do is for everyone. And we really leverage local partners who are subject matter experts and can be nonpartisan and educate folks. And then this is a really important one, resident input and leadership. So when we think about this, I think one thing we've learned is like, we have to offer and ask residents how they want to be engaged or if they want to be engaged. And we also have to be willing to provide support to our staff or who might be feeling, for any number of reasons, a little bit hesitant to engage residents around voting, because voting is so close to politics. And those conversations make people uncomfortable. And I think CIC, or at least the feedback I've gotten from CICs, is they feel less confident about how to navigate those boundaries. And you know, there's just this association with voting and politics. And so just holding space and having discussions with your staff about that, it's been really helpful for us so that they feel comfortable turning around and engaging residents and basically having very similar conversations. And then, I mean, another thing that's always helped is like where you can focus on kind of the local lens. So kind of moving away from federal level politics and trying to really focus on the local community politics. It can be helpful as well, at least we've found. And then if you go to the next slide. So one way I mentioned offer and ask. So last year we did a poll, basically a survey in our resident newsletter. We got like 250 residents responding. So it wasn't a huge sample size, but still it was helpful to just hear from residents about this topic. So I put some of the data that we got back and some of our learnings from that survey on these slides. So, you know, we found that a lot of people were planning to vote in the next election. And then we asked people who said that they weren't, why, so that we could better understand why they weren't planning on it. Again, this can help get your staff comfortable with the kinds of conversations they might be having if they're phone banking or they're helping someone register to vote who doesn't want to or isn't interested. If you go to the next slide. Great. And this was a really important question for us to understand. So for anyone that indicated that they weren't voting because they have a hard time getting to their polling place, we wanted to understand what the barrier was. And so I have some of those responses up here. And you can see transportation was a huge reason, which is why we allocated some of our budget into those Uber and Lyft gift cards. And then finally, we asked residents, are you interested in getting involved in this POA Votes initiative in your community? And 70 of them said yes. So we just dispatched that information to the community impact coordinators so that they could reach back out to those residents and say, hey, thanks for taking this survey. In it, you said you wanted to get involved. We're so happy. And here's some of my ideas. What do you think? And so just kind of asking some of those questions where you can and inviting residents to join you. That's been a great start for us. And I'm sure the level of leadership and the kinds of engagement will only change with time as we get deeper into this work. Great, and if you go to the next, yeah, so another consideration for us was measuring our progress and using data to do that. POA has made, an investment in voter engagement. We want to understand how we're doing with it. So one thing we measure progress through is these every other year surveys. We call them the resident questionnaire. They measure a bunch of different things, but one of the questions that we ask is, are you registered to vote? So there's self-reported voter registration rates by property. We have that information. We have it over time now. So over the last like 7 or 8 years. And then the other thing that we measure is we try to measure engagement. So the number of events that a CIC hosted related to voter engagement, and then the number of residents that they helped register or update or confirm their registration with. So also, like when we talk about voter registration, in my head, that umbrella is not just registration, but it's updating it or just confirming. Like maybe somebody's address hasn't changed, but the act of helping them check their registration status just helps build their confidence that like, okay, great, I'm still active. I don't have to worry about that when I go to the poll. So like all of those things to me count as voter registration, even if you're not registering a new voter. So I will, oh yeah, you can go to the next slide now. I can't say enough great things about Our Homes, Our Votes and the Housing Providers Council. It is definitely worth the time and it's not even that much investment. You go to these great webinars and you go to their website and check out what everybody else is doing around this, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel at all. You just pick and choose what works for your organization or for the community that you're serving. And that's so powerful because I know a lot of you all are doing resident services work, and there are so many different things that we're helping people with or supporting people in. So just, not having to reinvent the wheel, it's been so valuable. And then, yes, in 2020, the NLIHC was so helpful in helping us try to navigate the public data procurement process for voting records and then to even analyze it. So I don't want to say that capacity will be there for this election. I'll let Courtney answer that, but they are not afraid to kind of go deep and, engage with you if you're feeling overwhelmed about how you should be measuring your progress or where you want to go with it. I think there's just a lot of really smart people in the room who are also really passionate about this work, and it's a really great community to be a part of. Great, and so what's next in 2024? So our organizational goals, we want to reach 10,000 POA residents with our Get Out the Vote efforts. And so that could be anything from, we're casting a wide net for how we define reach. So that could be, it could be voter registration or updating the registration. Could be someone that attends one of our voting events. It could be somebody that we send an email blast out to or make a phone call to. And you can see some of our other goals here. I want to be mindful of time. But I just wanted to kind of share what we are hoping to cover this year in our voter engagement efforts, just in case it is something that you're thinking about as well. And so I'll leave it there, Mina.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Those are all really helpful resources and ideas and strategies. So we hope folks can use those in their initiatives and in their campaigns. And we want to leave some time here for questions. If there are any questions you have, you can put those in the Q&A function. So I'll give folks a moment here to do that. See if you have any questions coming in. One quick takeaway, would love to hear from you both what your one word of advice or one takeaway would be to an organization that's launching a voter engagement initiative for the first time. Maybe we can start with Lauren on that.
I'm trying to think of the right word. I would say this probably isn't I would say capacity. Like I'm always just thinking about how to take what every organization has a different set of resources or limited capacity for how to invest in this specific topic. So just think about how to do what you can with what you have. And that is so worth it, no matter what that is. And so that's helped us a lot when we're trying to make decisions about how to support our staff in this work. And so, yeah, I don't know if that was the right word, but that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I think that's great. It can be a lot of information and a lot of things to do. So start with what you can and go from there.
Yeah.
Courtney?
My advice is start early. And a lot of these pieces can take a long time to coordinate and get everyone on board and make sure everyone's properly trained. And so even though the November election might feel very far away, it's never too early to get started. There's primary elections. November isn't the only one. So the earlier you start, the more you can cover meeting the registration deadline for any primaries that are happening earlier. So start early. My words of maybe wisdom.
That's words, definitely. I just wanted to quickly touch on this. Oh, it looks like we have one question. So do you have any tips on recruiting or involving college and university students? So that's an interesting question if either of you have engaged maybe students or more broadly other volunteers in these initiatives.
In 2020, which was before I joined NLIHC, but I know we had some social work students join in doing the get out the vote like reminder calls. So that's if you have a nearby university, maybe there's like a public service center or something like that, or a study program that's aligned with these goals. I think that's a very common place where you can get volunteers. I've also heard of partnerships with law schools to do voter ID clinic or helping people who are returning citizens navigate the voting rights restoration process that exists in some states.
Lauren, have you had any volunteers engaged, or is that something, I know you talked about resident engagement and supporting.
Right. Yeah, we haven't engaged specifically colleges and universities around voter engagement. We work with them in other areas of our work, like a nursing student program that would come and serve some senior residents. But yeah, I would say the resident volunteers have been a huge resource for us, and just a great way to get people used to the idea of, I mean, so our community impact team sits on the property management team. So there's this whole other piece of it where you're trying to get somebody used to hearing from their landlord about voter engagement. And that takes a lot of trust building, and that takes time. So I don't think volunteers from a university or college are a bad idea at all. I think that's capacity building for sure. We haven't encountered that.
Thank you. And I love that point about trust building as well. It's very important. Okay, well, we are almost out of time, and I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So before we head out, we just wanted to provide you all with some additional resources to help you think about civic engagement and voter engagement, and really how to support resident voice and agency. We realize that the work you all do, resident services, is so important to lifting up resident voices, and SAFE has released several resources and reports around resident voice and agency. We have a toolkit around resident-centered outcomes measurement and engagement. We have another toolkit that includes a set of guiding questions, including around voter engagement, for surveying residents and understanding that piece of it. We also have another resident voice and agency analysis, and our impact of home report that I referenced earlier talks a lot about data from our SAFE members and their work to support civic and voter engagement as well. So those resources are in the chat, and we'll share those resources in follow-up to this webinar as well. Next slide, please. And if you haven't checked us out, here are some additional, more broadly, CORES resources for you to look at. We have our CORES resource library, which includes a number of practitioner-developed templates and tools and research and other resources you can access on civic engagement, resident agency, and really resident engagement, but more broadly, other resources around resident services, best practices. We have our quarterly newsletter, so you can learn more about other upcoming webinars and trainings, as well as other industry news. And all of our webinars are also included in that CORES resource library and on our CORES YouTube channel. And you can also find us on LinkedIn and X as well to keep up to date on what we're up to. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope this webinar was helpful. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Courtney, for all that amazing information and those resources for folks to use and continue to be engaged in this important work. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.